If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. Outdoorsman, what's your most terrifying encounter in the woods/forest? I'm not an outdoorsman, but I was camping with a group of friends. We were in high school on spring break and decided to all go camping for a couple of days. Takes place in the late 90s. 3 tents, a truck, and SUV. There were 8 of us the first night. We drove far from the main road towards the mountains. We found what looked like a good campsite, flat ground and a good size field next to it. Now as teenagers we wanted to have fun, so we had alcohol and weed. The first night we all got wasted. One friend pissed himself and another threw up on the hood of another friend's truck. Scratched up the paint trying to clean it up. Anyways, on to the scary stuff. The second night there were 6 of us. There wasn't much partying going on and everyone except a friend and I stayed up cooking food over the fire, munchies. We were cooking and he's telling me a story, and as he's telling me this story I hear a scream in the distance. I stop him. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "No," he replied. "Alright, it could be that I'm a little buzzed." We finish eating and decide to call it a night. On the way to our tent I hear the scream again, and it's in that open field. My heart stops immediately, I get goosebumps and I'm terrified. My friend turns around and I ask him, "Did you hear that?" "Yes," he replied. Now to describe this scream, it sounds like a woman giving off the most blood-curdling scream. Extremely high-pitched and loud. Now me feeling a little buzzed, I'm thinking of this ugly chupacabra alien-looking creature just staring at us in the distance. Ready to run up and kill us. We immediately jump into the tent and remain quiet. Our breathing is quiet but we are on alert. This is twice I've heard the scream. We hear it again, it's much closer now. Again I'm thinking of this creature never seen by anyone because it kills everyone who sees it that is coming to kill us. My heart is racing and I think this might be it. All of a sudden another scream, but from the opposite direction. Oh my god, there are 2 of them. The screaming continues from both directions probably every 20 seconds or so. It's like they are talking to each other, planning on how to kill us. We're surrounded. We finally whisper to each other, "What do we do?" It's probably been a good 2 minutes since we jumped in the tent, but it felt like an eternity. There's another friend in the tent passed out. He never wakes up. My friend remembers he has both sets of car keys. He quickly presses the panic buttons. We let the car alarms go off for a few minutes. During this time we couldn't hear any screaming. We can see the car lights flashing against the tent. When we thought the creature got scared away, we stopped the car alarms and both yelled loudly, "Get the duck up, everyone." We unzip the tent. He's already unlocked the car doors. We see people emerging from the other tents in panic. We all jump into one of the vehicles, start it up and lock the doors. Everyone is asking what's wrong. We explained the screams and asked them if they heard. They all replied no. We explained what happened and I think because of how terrified we were they believed us. We all agreed to leave the camp and drive to one of their houses and spend the night there. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking the creature somehow attached itself to the car or followed us home just waiting. Daylight couldn't have come quick enough. We had some breakfast and told his parents the story. Well, now they think we are crazy. We decide to head back to the site. We arrive and there are large paw prints around the campsite. One of my friends suggests it could be mountain lions. The most terrifying part is when looking at the paw prints, our shoe prints had walked over the paw prints. Now we were careful not to disrupt the scene when we returned. This means when we heard the screams they may have been closer than we thought. After the car alarm scared them away, we stepped over their paw prints. I looked to the empty field where I heard the screams and got chills. I was hiking a pretty popular mountain in my area. It sits roughly 10 minutes from the heart of a shopping area and a lot of people use the campground area for B-days, picnics, etc. There's a long trail that loops around the entire mountain and an offshoot from that on the backside that takes you to the mountain peak. Well, most people use the incredibly short 5-mile hike straight up the front of the mountain. I always like to do this larger loop. One day I was hiking this loop on the way back down the mountain. Besides the offshoot that takes you up the mountain, there are also a series of offshoots that act as shortcuts to help bypass the longer and more boring parts of the loop trail. As I was at around the halfway point, from one of these offshoots stepped a man in a full suit. I'm talking jacket, dress shoes, the whole 9 yards. Immediately I got the feeling that I shouldn't look at this man for too long. Not for any real supernatural reason, but more this just felt so out of place. I didn't want to get involved in whatever this man was doing. Keeping my head down, I quickly passed him by but did check behind me to make sure he had continued on his way. As I continued down the trail, admittedly a little weirded out, I couldn't help but jump a little when as I came up on the next offshoot in the opposite direction that the man had just gone, the same man in the same suit stepped out and onto the loop trail. I immediately realized how wrong this was but rationalized that it must just be a duo that were hiking together. Without breaking stride in hopes not to bring my attention to this man now approaching me, I quickly put my head down and started to jog and didn't stop for the next mile on the way back to my car. I've rationalized that experience in my mind now, but that still to this day is the most real paranormal experience I've ever had. I practically live in the woods. Most animal encounters are pretty mild, but there has only been a handful of encounters that have made me reconsider my choice of surroundings. I've nearly hit deer while turning into my driveway, been trapped in my car by coyotes, and have had to chase off a druggie or two, but there was this one time that sticks with me to this day. I was watching TV late one night when I heard what sounded like someone in heavy boots stomping around on my front porch. I grabbed something for self-defense, flipped on a light, and went out to find some creature. I'm not exactly sure what it was because I didn't get a good look. All I know is that it was big and hairy. And fast. Almost instantly as soon as I saw it, it leapt off my porch and took off into the woods. I thought it might be a black bear, but they don't normally live in my area, so I called wildlife resources to check it out. We found some tracks, but they didn't look anything like a bear's, more like a big cat or dog. The wildlife officer said the tracks looked similar to a mountain lion's, but they were, as he described, oversized and sunk too far into the ground, like a much heavier animal made them. The claw marks on my porch didn't match anything that he'd ever seen either, so he was clueless. I was close enough to get a general size, and it was about the size of a cow. Other than that, I didn't get a real good look as right as I saw it move, I was halfway back inside the house. I don't know what the hell it was, but if I ever see it again, I'll probably just pack my things and leave. Fortunately, that was about 12 years ago. I haven't seen it since and I never want to. I'm not an outdoorsman, but me and my two friends were in a forest near Mount Hood. The forest felt creepy, but we just thought that because it was our first time camping together that we were nervous. So we went on. A few days into our trip in this area we spotted what seemed like a man. Take in mind the time was around 5 or 6 p.m. and we were literally in the middle of nowhere. The nearest town was quite far away from us, I think around 7 or 8 miles away, so it couldn't have been a man, not unless somehow we were being followed or something. That evening we were having a campfire, drinking a couple beers and just having fun when a loud crash happened. It sounded like it was coming from a few hundred meters away. We dropped our shit and threw ourselves into a tent. Take in mind we had a one-man tent for all of us individually. So all of us in this small cramped tent just listening, with a small gap in the door for us to look out of. It was something like a horror story. That night none of us got to sleep because the sounds coming from outside the tent were horrific. We heard footsteps but not normal ones like a large creature was walking around. After a few moments we heard what sounded like a car screech sound in the distance, then a growl from the same creature. The creature nearest to us ran away. That night we stayed up. The next day we made our way the 9 or 10 miles back. We all agreed that they were Sasquatch. Or some other mystery creature. Back on September 22, 2018, I did a solo day hike up San Bernardino Peak, which is about 17 miles out, and back up to 10,649 feet. I did that procrastinating, do I really want to do this today or not? Thing, and by the time I dragged myself to the Angeles Oaks trailhead it was already noon, which is very late to start a hike of that distance. Knowing that, I tore up the trail as fast as I could, knowing that the sun would be setting shortly before 7 p.m. and I really didn't want to do another night hike, despite half my hikes having some portion done in the dark with a headlamp. I got to the summit shortly before 5 p.m., took some photos and booked it down the mountain as fast as I could, knowing I'd only have a couple hours. Even though the sunset was at about 7 p.m., the tree canopy over the last 2 miles to the car made it much darker on the trail as the sun started casting long shadows. I was lost in thought, trying not to think about how dark and creepy the woods are at night, when I realized I couldn't hear anything except my footsteps. Usually, you hear all kinds of chirps or other sounds, but it was just eerily quiet. I don't know why, but I got this intense fear that I was being watched and followed. I tried not to think about it, it was just my mind playing games with me, but then, I heard rustling in the bushes. Again, I don't know why, but I panicked. I never panic. I broke into a sprint and ran as fast as I could, without tripping, down that mountain. At one point, I had to stop because I needed to change the batteries in my headlamp. I did the 8 miles back to the car in about 2.5 hours. To this day, I don't think I've ever had such an intense feeling of dread or fear. A couple of years ago, 2 friends and I, we'll call them D and J, went to a place called Look Rock. It's a concrete observation tower at the top of Chilowee Mountain in Blount County, Tennessee. To get to the tower, you park in a small pull-off, then walk a paved trail half a mile up the mountain. I've been up to this tower many times, and there's usually some kind of energy in the air. You can't see it, but you can feel it. It's like the woods themselves have acquired sentience, and they're just barely tolerating your presence. Anyway, this particular trip was eerily quiet. Typically in the woods you can hear woodsy sounds, cicadas, wind rustling in the trees, the occasional animal, but this night was silent. Going back to my simile, it's like the sentient woods were terrified of something, and were paralyzed with fear. The trip up the mountain was uneventful, apart from the general air of creepiness. We went up to the tower, and shot the proverbial shit for a couple of hours. Finally, around 3-ish, we decided it was time to wrap it up. We began the trip back down. At the base of the tower, there's a couple of flattish boulders, about 6 feet or so in diameter, placed as a decoration. What I saw on the boulder was the start of a terrifying night. Nobody else in my group noticed, but squatted on the boulder was a solid black form, about 4 to 5 feet tall, with deeply glowing red eyes. It stared at us for a second, then vanished into thin air. Assuming my eyes were just ducking with me, I reluctantly carried on past the boulders. The feeling of uneasiness followed us up until about the 30% point. On this trail, there's a point where the trail turns 90 degrees to the right, when going back down. The trail you're walking on continues forward, but it's just an ATV access for the rangers. This is in the Smoky Mountain National Park. About 20 feet or so before the turn, I notice an extra pair of footsteps. There were only 3 of us, but 4 sets of footsteps. I stopped and looked, and right behind Jay was a 7-foot tallish heat distortion, like when you look over a flaming grill on a summer day. It was vaguely human-shaped. As with the form on the boulder, after looking at it for a few seconds, it vanished. At this point, we double-timed it back to the car. They hadn't seen it, but they felt it. Halfway down the trail, there's a spot where one tree has fallen into the split trunk of another tree, so it forms kind of a triangle against the ground. At the top of the triangle, the same crouched black form with deep red eyes. Again, it vanished after looking at it. We made it back down to the truck, everything in our minds screaming run. We did about 90 down Foothills Parkway until we made it back to the highway. From there, the trip was uneventful. We dropped Jay off at his house, and proceeded to Dee's house, about 15 minutes away. As I was pulling out of Dee's driveway, his phone rang. He answered it, turned pale, and flagged me down. Something had happened at Jay's house. We booked it back to Jay's, where we found every light in his house on. We went in, and found him in bed, with a Bible in one hand, and a .45 in the other. Jay's bedroom faces a streetlight. Also, in his room, he has a nightlight, a clock, and a stereo, all of which keep his room fairly well lit. He went to bed, then the room had suddenly gone dark. He could still see the streetlight, the clock, the stereo, etc., and they were still lit, but they cast no glow into the room. He said he couldn't even see his hand in front of his face. He went on to say that something had put its hand on his throat and growled in his face, then left. By the time we got there, it had already left. Just to be sure, we lined the doors and windows with salt. I had read somewhere that salt kept stuff away. We never heard from the thing again. To this day I have no idea what it was, but it's what I picture when someone uses the word imp. We've been back to the tower several times since, but it's never been the same. The woods have always seemed quiet, and afraid. I had just turned 22 and my parents had sold their house and purchased a place out in the country. On the property there was a big shed not far from the house that I decided to turn into my place. Now I felt kind of uncomfortable in the shed sometimes, but my dog kept me company, so it wasn't so bad. Anyway, I had been in there maybe 2 weeks, and one night I'm on the computer, my dog asleep at my feet, and I need to pee, so I get up and go outside to piss. It's a beautiful clear night and the stars were incredible. Next thing I hear the shed door slam behind me. I turn immediately and try to open it, but it won't budge. Now from inside the shed I can hear my dog start to growl, quietly at first then louder. Now he's barking and I'm panicking trying to get the door open. I must mention that I'm 6'5" and well built, play sports etc., but even ramming my full weight into the door won't open it, and I'm really panicking now as my dog's barks turned into whines, then whimpering, then silence, and with all my might I slam into the door and it flies open. The light is off inside now and it's pitch black, it won't turn back on and I'm in complete darkness. Can't see my dog anywhere and I stumble around trying to find a torch. Finally I find it and pick it up and turn on my torch, and I wasn't prepared for what I'd see next. My dog had literally squashed itself into the furthest, darkest corner of the room, eyes closed, and is shaking violently. I immediately moved towards him, and as soon as I got within reach of him, he leapt at me into my arms and wouldn't move. I picked him up and I swear I've never ran so fast in my goddamn life. I never stepped foot in that shed ever again, and my dog wouldn't even go near that part of the property. I don't know what happened in that shed that night, but I'll never forget it. When I was younger, I would visit my family in Alaska. They were located in a small village on the Bering Sea where the native Alaskan culture was very much alive. One day we decided that we would take boat ride down the coast to collect herring eggs on seaweed and seagull eggs. You may laugh, but this is a way of living for the native Alaskans. The boat ride was about an hour long, the ocean was stagnant with a salty smell, and the lighthouse was just beginning to leave our sight. We pulled up to a swallow bay and started collecting the herring eggs on seaweed with a rake and looked for seagull eggs. After we gathered enough to satisfy our needs, we decided to anchor on shore and set up a fire to enjoy some of our hard work. We drank campfire coffee, boiled in a pot with no filter, and ate some of our gatherings. My grandmother, who is full Inupiaq Eskimo, started telling old myths of Alaska to us. She told us the story of the Yukon giants, civilizations of Sasquatches who live on the Yukon, and the little people of the coast, aliens with extraordinary powers. The hair on my neck was erect and I was getting very jittery. The whole vibe of the situation changed when she was telling these stories. In fact, it was quite ominous. At the end of the story, she stood straight up and said, "We have to go right now." We never questioned her and packed our things up right away. She was 5'8" with big hands and feet and a round face. We drowned the fire and launched the boat back home. At that moment, 6 massive grizzlies stormed over the small hill in which we were camped at the bottom. I have never been so amazed at the ferocity of an animal. If there was one animal that I would never duck with, it would be the grizzly, and I still believe that if we did not leave at the time, that we may have been in a horrible situation. But it doesn't stop there. A fog bank rolled in and the weather took turn for the worse. The sea was rolling and visibility was less than 1 mile. Somehow we managed to see the lighthouse just as things were starting to look grim. I always knew my grandmother was a spiritual woman, but until this day I do not understand how she knew when to leave. I was on a canoe trip in Canada, in a very remote part of the Boundary Waters. One night, after dinner, we had some free time, so I decided to go on a hike and explore the area around the island. I did this every night because I liked to know the layout of the area. I was alone, I know, but had a flashlight, whistle, compass, knife, etc., and everybody knew where I was headed. I also made sure to stay where I could see the campsite, which was still pretty far because I was going uphill. It was pretty dark, but not pitch black. Dark enough to necessitate a flashlight in some places. Anyway, I eventually reached the top of the hill, where it got pretty flat. I decided to keep going until I could see the water on the other side. The campsite was on a peninsula of an island. I wouldn't be able to see the campsite, but I thought I wouldn't have to go far, so I went anyway against my better judgment. Well, it was farther than I expected, but I figured, well, I've already gone this far, so duck it. I climbed an oak tree to see if I could see how far the water was. I could see it just barely, but I also saw something more interesting than the water. There was a little spring-fed pond about 100 off, with a little creek running from it. I decided I would go see it and then turn back, especially because I should have been back already, and it was getting dark. So I went to the little spring pond thing. The first thing I noticed was that it was strangely cold. The air was still, it was just a weird atmosphere. As soon as I was in the clearing, I had a strange feeling of dread in my chest. I felt scared and nervous. So I looked around. It was about 20 by 10. There was no plants or trees for about 10 feet from it in any direction. The only thing was a big dead oak tree. It appeared to have been struck by lightning, as it was burned and cracked down the middle, how a tree that got struck by lightning looks. It had fallen over, creating a cave hole where the roots used to be. So anyway, standing right in front of the hole, facing the pond and me, is a creature. It looked almost exactly like a wolf, but it stood on its hind legs, standing almost as straight as a human. It was easily 6 tock standing. Besides its posture, the only thing human about it was its hands. They looked kind of like human hands, but with pads and claws like a dog's feet. On its head were some horn/antler things. They looked like either deer antlers or ram horns. It had dark silver eyes. And it was staring right at me. I made eye contact, and instantly felt that I was going to die. I know this sounds cliché, but I felt frozen, staring into its eyes. And then, as I looked into its eyes, it seemed to talk to me. It wasn't moving its mouth, and the words didn't sound like any language I've heard. It sounded almost inhuman. But I could tell it was speaking. It spoke for about the length of a sentence, and as it finished, I unfroze. I turned around and ran back the way I came, and maybe 100 later when I turned around, it was gone. Not by the pond, not chasing me, and nowhere to be seen. It was gone. I could feel it, that it wasn't chasing or watching or stalking. I continued running all the way back to camp, crying, and went straight to bed with my knife next to my pillow. The next morning, I woke up as soon as the sun rose, cooked breakfast and began to break camp by myself as fast as I could. We were gone in less than 45 minutes and I pushed everyone to keep paddling as long as they could. I just wanted to put as much distance between me and that thing as I could. The rest of the trip went beautifully, I really enjoyed myself and nothing went wrong, but I still had a small feeling of dread, fright, and anxiety, the same I felt near the pond. Ever since, I've told one person. I still have no idea what it was or what happened. A few years ago, a few friends and I sitting around the house drinking and bored. Decide to pack up a tent and some sleeping bags in a car and drive out to some local state land. This is early fall in Michigan, way past dark and totally spur of the moment. Aside from lots of beer and snacks, we didn't pack anything but the bags and tent. Drive out to state land down some rutty four-wheel paths. Dark as hell, only trees around. No moon, a light, cold breeze is blowing lots of dead leaves around. Get out, set up tent in the headlights, commence drinking. After an hour or so we decide to wander around. I had a flashlight app on my phone, click it on and away we go into the darkness. I should mention the state land we were camped on is very close to a famous urban legend area where creatures known as the witchy wolves supposedly roam. My friends and I were all late 20s and way past believing in the legends, but it's pertinent to the rest of the story. Walk a little ways, talking loudly and singing badly to announce our presence to anything else in the woods. Spooking each other and laughing our asses off. Keep teasing each other about the witchy wolves. I killed the flashlight a few times to freak everyone out. Good times. Come up on a pond. Big enough we can't see the other side in the darkness. Take a break near its edge. Drink some more, burn one, bullshit and laugh. Aside from the leaves and wind, not a sound in the woods, no lights to be seen in any direction. As we're talking, one of my friends grabs a stick and casually tosses it over the pond to see if she can get an idea for how big it is. First stick splashes. Grabs another, chucks it harder. Second stick splashes. Grabs a third. Before she can chuck it we hear a huge splash in the pond. Huge. Like someone just dropped a cinder block from a 3-story height. We all freeze. I take my light out and shine it over the pond thinking a deer wandered out from the woods and into the pond or something. Looking for a glint of light off of eyeballs. Nothing. We start yelling, "Hey! And I see you and whatever." Nothing. After waiting silently for a few more minutes, friend chucks stick. Splashes down. And then immediately after we hear the huge splashing again, but this time repetitively boom, boom, boom like a ducking Sasquatch is running through the water. We turn and hightail it the duck back to camp, which wasn't very far away. Get drunk and try to forget about it. Tease each other about being pusses and daring each other to go back. We all spooned that night. The next morning we walked back and checked the pond. Wasn't very big. The other side from where we were standing and where the splashing sounded like it was coming from was all woods right down to the pond's edge. Walked the whole perimeter. No tracks, no sign of what it was. Kept thinking about it the whole next day, it was bugging the shit out of me. Then it popped into my head like a light bulb and I felt like an idiot. Ducking beaver. There was downed beaver trees in a few spots close to the pond. When they feel threatened/scared they slap their tails on the water. I didn't tell my friends I figured it out and still insist it's the witchy wolves. Okay, so I was traveling, this is in Australia for context, and I was at this campsite about 20 minutes past a small town and had gotten there about an hour-ish after dark. Now I was the only person there, and when I called the off-site caretaker to book, he said that since it was just me that I could use the day shelter/kitchen, so instead of setting up my tent in the dark I decided to drag my sleeping bag inside where I had some actual light. Hours later I realized I required something for my car, so I drag open the sliding door, and this wasn't a small door, it was one of those big loud ones like you would see on a barn. I was looking out into the darkness as there was no lights or moon, just the glow from the lights behind me. Now, in case you have never been in a situation like this, the light reaches about 10 meters and then has about 1 meter where it drops off into nothingness. And in this small patch I saw 4 legs. These were not just normal legs, they were like those of a dog and long like human leg length long, and they were bright white and stretched up to where they should connect to the body of the animal, but there was nothing there. Then it began to move. The legs walked. They walked in parallel to the building, making sure that they remained in that gray corridor, then disappeared into the darkness. I decided that I didn't really need to get whatever it was from my car and slept barricaded in the tiny office. To this day I don't know what they were, and I have looked into it, nor do I know how long they were there before I saw it. But I do know that that thing was smart enough to know how humans see and where the gray corridor was from my viewpoint. I lived in Southern California at the time, up in the San Gabriel Mountains a couple hours east of LA. I know when people think of Cali all they seem to picture are beaches, but I assure you the land here is diverse. Very much so. My hometown is super tiny and has a fairly popular ski resort on the western side of town. If you take the only highway out past this ski resort for several miles is nothing but forest, and more forest. A few campgrounds and day use areas, a couple Forest Service buildings, and a very old gold mine is all that is out there. After those few things there is nothing but national forest, and then one insanely isolated very old restaurant that still functions, and then back to forest for a long time. Anyway, just setting the scene a little. I was about 10 to 11 when this happened and it was almost Christmas. It snowed quite a bit that year and was snowing on the evening of this happening. My stepdad decided that we would cut down our own tree that year, and so we got into my mom's big flipping Dodge truck. Seriously, that thing was way overkill, Mom, and headed off towards the mine, which was a couple miles past the ski resort. We got to the base of the road and were talking and laughing, etc. Stepdad was driving pretty slow since it was snowing pretty good. They had plowed part of this road recently too, and there were big snow berms on either side of the road, damn near up to the top of the truck cab. So probably a good 8 feet off the ground. So it's just barely getting dark at this time, too. Not quite dark, but twilight I guess. So not dark enough that we can't see anything, but dark enough that the headlights in the truck are on. Quite suddenly, from over on my side there comes a huge, dark shape that arcs over the top of the snow berm. It lands in the middle of the road fairly, gracefully, almost. My stepdad slams on the brakes. I'm too stunned to speak or even scream. Because there, crouching in the road, is a goddamn werewolf. I can't describe it like anything else. It had a long muzzle, and pointy ears like a dog or wolf, but a bit longer / pointier. It was covered in fur and its paws were long digits that ended in claws. Not quite a hand, but not quite a paw either. Reminded me more of a raccoon's hand, honestly. I don't remember it having a tail. It was very large and looked strong. Anyway, this all happened in mere seconds. The thing jumps down and lands in a crouch, briefly glances at us in the truck as my stepdad slammed the brakes, and then it just vaulted up and over the berm on the left side easy as pie. It didn't use all fours to jump. It just crouched on its long hind legs and jumped. If I had to guess I would say it was maybe 6 to 7 feet tall if it were standing straight up. More than a little terrifying even if it was a simple and extremely quick encounter. My stepdad refused to talk about it when I asked, terrified, if he had seen that thing too. I knew he must have though because he hit the brakes so fast, and he was wide-eyed and his face had broken out in a sweat. I never did bring it up again because we had not the best relationship and I haven't talked to him since my mom and he got divorced. I do sometimes think about it though, and am very tempted to contact him and ask, but I just don't know if it would be worth it or if he would even remember. I feel like I can never forget, though. Earlier this summer I was hiking in the 100-mile wilderness in Maine. A couple days into my trip I got really sick. Sore throat, headache, fatigue, loss of appetite. About the worst cocktail of symptoms for hiking long distance. I had found a tick on me and I was terrified that I might have Lyme disease. I decided to get off trail and see a doctor, which is easier said than done in the most remote, inaccessible section of the whole Appalachian Trail. Thankfully, there are old logging roads which crisscross the wilderness, so I decided to turn off onto a road which, I was told, led to a campground. There I hoped to find some day hikers and get a ride into town. As soon as I turned off the ad, it started pouring rain, which only increased my misery. A few minutes later I noticed a dog in the woods. Strange, I thought. Then I saw another dog. And another, and another. About a dozen big hunting hounds, fenced off, randomly in the middle of nowhere, Maine. They barked at me, slavering, and pawed at the chicken wire fence, which did not seem strong enough to contain them. This was slightly disconcerting, but the brown trouser moment came when I spotted a lone figure in the woods, what seemed like a tall man in a hooded blue rain jacket and pants. I couldn't see his face, and he just stood there, still as a statue. Severely spooked, I hiked out of there on the double. In the backcountry it's generally good manners to say hello and exchange pleasantries, but this guy didn't say a word. Maybe it was because of the rain, maybe he was feeding bodies to his hounds out there, I may never know. But he definitely saw me, and I could tell that he was watching me go past. When I was younger, I used to routinely sneak out of the house at night to meet up with friends and perform acts of minor mischief and light vandalism. One of the newer additions to the group lived a little out of the way, but we were always game to pick him up because it meant crossing through the tall grasses of a farm that stood between his and our corner of suburbia. One crisp, cool autumn evening, we had concluded our business of hopping a pool fence and rearranging the poolside furniture, scandalous, and most of the other teens had gone home for the evening, so I decided to walk my buddy home. We cut through the tall grasses in the farm, and took a seat in the middle of them by a tree that had a series of small boulders that made for ideal sitting. We talked the usual teenage angsty crap, who liked who, what you were going to do when you grew up, who was going to move out first to escape their oppressive suburban life first. There was a lull in conversation, and I remember hearing a dog barking in the distance by the nearby farmhouse. I glanced up, and looming over the tall glass were three person-shaped forms. Not together. Not moving. Spread several hundred feet apart in the field, stock still. To clarify, this was a field of grass. No scarecrows, no trees save the one, and nothing that could realistically make these shapes. I froze up, and looked over to my friend, shakily asking if he could see it. I didn't clarify, because he gave a terrified nod. None of the figures moved an inch. Indistinct and shadowy, they remained exactly rooted to the spot, and we were absolutely petrified. Then, closer than close, the insisting growling of a dog no less than 10 feet away from us. Somewhere in the grass. Right on top of us. We both got up and bolted, but nothing chased after. Not the dog. Not the figures. As I stood huddled with my friend hiding behind a car on a suburban street, the moon tucked behind a cloud formation that cast a small pale thread of light down only on us, I believed in ghosts. I stayed at my friend's house for as long as it took for us to think up a reasonable explanation to what we'd seen. I had to get home, and the only real way back was through that field. Plus, we had to prove it to ourselves. Prove to ourselves that it had been trees we'd failed to notice, or scarecrows that had been put up for autumn. Anything at all. We came back to the field, armed with aluminum baseball bats for self-defense, and shakily stepped back into the area with the one tree and the standing stones, and surveilled the field. Nothing. The horizon was completely consistent. Tall grass. No shadows. No shapes. No trees. No scarecrows. No dog. Nothing to explain what we'd seen, and nothing to stop me from bolting across the property terrified out of my mind. No one believes that we saw what we say we saw, or think we're blowing it out of proportion. Those grasses were head high to me at 6 feet, and the stationary figures we saw had ended easily 2 feet over the grass. I didn't sleep well that night, and while I've mostly put it out of my mind, I won't forget. The farm was sold off and turned into a development not long after I moved away, and some nights I can't help but think, I hope they didn't build near the standing stones. I was on an island in the middle of the Pacific, doing my first ever project away from home. There was maybe 30 people on this 3-mile island, and most had finished their respective jobs and headed into camp for the night. My job at the time was to hike around after dark to make sure the coconut crabs weren't eating all my ant traps. They are shy, curious creatures and will steal stuff when you're not looking to rip apart and sniff or chew, so that night I had a large male crab as my only company in the palm forest. When we reached a break in the trees, I stopped and looked up at the stars for a second. And froze. Somewhere, in the pitch black darkness overhead was the freakiest goddamn sound, and it was getting louder. It was coming towards us. It literally sounded like a fussy baby crying. Overhead. Flying towards us. I looked at my crab friend and he looked at me with the same freaked out expression, and I bolted. I ran straight for the research tent. Some time before I reached it, my brain must have kicked back on, because the first thing I said to another person was, "Is there a bird that sounds like a flying ghost baby?" Yes. There is. It's called a wedge-tailed shearwater, and it freaked me the FK out. There's been a few. Stumbled on moose several times, often females with calves. They don't like that. Sometimes bears, sometimes wolves, never any issues there, though I backpack alone a lot in the Rockies, and there have been a few times where I've woken up to animals around my tent. Rarely find out what they are though. Set my backpack down once after a nap way back in the backcountry once to go number 2. Was so groggy I couldn't find my way back to my pack. Looked for an hour and never found it. Had to hike 10 miles back down the mountain with no food/water before dark set in. Fortunately, went back with a buddy the next weekend and found the pack. The scariest though was when I was hunting alone back when I was a kid growing up in the Appalachian mountains. Ended up falling asleep in a tree stand and woke up after dark. It was pitch black and I didn't have a light. My dad was going to pick me up off a private logging road about a mile down the mountain. As I started walking back, I begun to hear something keeping pace on the hillside behind me. When I would stop to listen, it would take a few steps then also stop. Eventually I got really freaked out and started running down the trail. All the while I could still make out the footsteps coming from behind me. When I made it to where my dad was supposed to pick me up, I saw he wasn't yet there and I started to panic. I ended up standing in the middle of the road with my gun pointed into the darkness, safety off, shaking and crying. As I stood there I could make out the sound of it occasionally moving around in the dark below of the trees but was too dark to see what it was. Finally I saw the light of my dad's truck coming up the road and jumped back so that the truck was between me and the thing. Jumped in and shined the spotlight into the woods only to see nothing there anymore. It caused me a lot of issues for a few years after the fact. My dad would always joked about how it was a coyote or maybe even black bear, but to this day I still swear whatever was following me had the footstep pattern of something moving on two legs. My father was an avid hunter and would make time every year to take me hunting in Oklahoma. We would typically hunt for whitetail, but we were not limited to the game as we also would hunt squirrel, turkey and rabbit. The land that we would hunt on was passed down through generations on my mother's side after her family received it in a land auction. The previous owners of the land were Choctaw natives like my father and I. The previous owners had tried multiple times to buy the land back from my grandmother on my mom's side of the family. The final time that she was asked by that family, a medicine man named Makati came to her house and said that the land had his family's burial site on it and that the spirits were angry that it was stolen from them. Again, my grandmother declined to sell the land. Many things have happened on this property that my family talks about, but I have only one truly horrific memory. My father and I would always hunt between 0530 to 1100 and we wouldn't exit the vehicle until the sun broke through the wood line. The time that I'm going to tell you about, however, didn't fit the standard hunting trip. It was after 1500 when we entered the woods that day. The plan was that he would enter the east side of a clear-cut an area of deforestation, and proceeded west about 30 to 45 minutes after I entered the south end of the woods, moving north, in which he would jump scare deer across my path and I would shoot one. As I entered the woods, the area was very calm in comparison to most days. There was a stale humidity about the area, and even though it was just a 10-acre patch of trees, it seemed like it took hours to get into position to move forward as there is no trails and the undergrowth is thick. Time seemed to be moving at an accelerated rate, and growing up in this area I was missing landmarks that I would normally take account of. The sun was setting, and as it was a time before cell phones, the fact that I didn't carry a watch made it even more troubling. The only sound my dad would ever allow in the woods while hunting was a whistle with a rhythmic tone. That way we could communicate our location. Find myself lost. I let out a whistle. About 3 seconds later from the north I heard his whistle, then one from the east, then one from the west, then one back from the east. Eventually the area around me was flooded by the sound of the whistles. My panic began to set in, me gripping the stock of my .30 with the moisture of my sweaty palms. I stood in place for what felt like an eternity, and I let out a less confident whistle this time. As I heard the first whistle I bolted towards it, rifle in hand, continuously taking in large gulps of air, my muscles aching, feeling as if battery acid were pumping through my veins. The fear kept me moving until I broke through the tree line to find that the sun was still burning in the sky. My father stared at me and my pale complexion, scolding me for scaring the animals away, stating that it sounded like I was running circles through the undergrowth, banging on trees. We never spoke of it, and that is the last time I went hunting. In the 90s, I was on a week-long backpacking trip with my uncle in the Colorado high country. He was a professional rock climbing trail guide at the time, so he knew his stuff while off the grid. The second day in, we were following some old trail that hadn't been groomed in years, and came across the outskirts of some random commune deep in the woods. We knew there were people there because we could see campfires and laughing/talking in the distance. My uncle immediately freaks out, tells me to keep quiet, and then made us backtrack nearly 5 miles, and then around. It was the first and only time I've actually seen him panic off the grid. Afterward, he lectured me that it was some kind of small sect or cult that had a rep for being very territorial in the area at the time, and was known to shoot at trespassers without provocation. I was about 16 years old, deer hunting in some very thick and rugged terrain in West Virginia. I was driving through some thickets in a small draw, and you tend to be pretty keyed up when you're doing that because you're trying to be sneaky and silent, but if you flush a deer, you may only have a second or two to see if it's a buck and get a shot off before they disappear into the woods. I heard something moving off to my left, saw a flash of white and gray fur, about the right size, and without even thinking about it I had my rifle to my shoulder, thumb on the safety, and was trying to find antlers through the sights. It was an old man. Had to be in his 70s. This was almost 40 years ago, and I can still see every detail like I'd taken a photo. He was wearing dark green pants, a white shirt, a gray wool sweater, and had a gray felt hat on with a feather in the brim. He had an old pump-action 12-gauge shotgun he was using like a walking stick. I guess he'd never heard of Blaze Orange. In some kind of weird reflex action I flipped the safety off, sights right dead center on that old man's chest. Then I guess there was a click of recognition and I flicked the safety right back on. Then I threw my rifle on the ground, sat down and threw up my breakfast and my lunch. Out camping. I was off foraging and finding kindling when I got a sense I was being watched. I felt a little off, so I readied my hatchet. I couldn't see what set me off, but I kept it in one hand while I got rest of my kindling. When I got back to camp I saw my side all messed up and several big claw marks on the tree I'd hung my food from. The food bag was still hanging there. I figured a bear or mountain lion was digging through my camp. My danger sense was still going, but I didn't have the daylight to get back to my car. I set my fire and kept myself ready for a fight. I prepped some alarm traps with a bit of 550 cord and my tent stakes. I improvised a hammock out of my tent tarp and the shredded remains of my tent. I used every last bit of cordage I had prepping for the night. The makeshift hammock was pretty comfy and where I positioned it I got a decent amount of heat from the fire. I think I dozed a few times in the night, but any stick crack or pop woke me up. At some point in the dark, my fire was low and I heard one of my alarm traps get set off. It sounded like the rope got tangled with an animal because it kept going a bit longer than I expected. My adrenaline kicked in and I jumped from my hammock in my camp shoes and made a bunch of noise like the Hulk. Hatchet and camp knife in hands I rushed the edge of my camp on the alarm side and I heard the cans from my alarm travel away. Whatever it was, their element of surprise was ruined. I didn't sleep the rest of the night and just kept an eye on my fire and the tree line. At dawn I did a quick recon and salvaged my traps. The one was missing as I suspected. I only searched a few yards around, but figured it was a lost cause. I packed up and hiked back to my car. The scariest part was not knowing what was out there. Maybe if I would have seen it too would have been able to rationalize the situation, but that was the last time I camped alone without a rifle. Had a truck pull into my deserted primitive camping area on national forest land around 2 a.m. and stop right next to my tent. Now, in context, I was camping alone. This was a designated camping area, and I was the farthest back from the road, a good 200 feet. I had no fire going. Still visible from the road, though. Anyone just wanting to turn around could have done so right at the front. Around 2 a.m., this truck comes in, drives all the way back to my tent, and stops right next to it, just sitting there. I could tell the type of vehicle by the silhouette its headlights cast through my tent. There was absolutely no legitimate reason for anyone to do that. So I'm there, in my small A-frame tent which I'd made the bad judgment of setting up with its door towards the road, thus providing me no cover to exit, and all I can do is sit there in my tent with my AR-15 at the ready, freezing my butt off in 39-degree weather because I had to crawl out of my sleeping bag and was just in my underwear, knowing if they mean harm and there's more than one person I'm almost certainly dead because I'm a sitting duck. Note, I had the AR-15 in the tent with me because it was bear country. Fortunately for me, they probably decided there wasn't anything worth stealing and left after a few minutes without getting out of their vehicle. All my valuable stuff was locked up in my SUV and all I had visible was some cookware and a small camp stove. I learned a few things from that. 1. Get a bigger tent that I can more easily move around in and it's quicker to get out of, and 2. Always set your tent up with the door facing away from the road to provide some degree of concealment if you need to exit. Remember, folks, not all predators walk on 4 legs. Some walk on 2.